Hello and welcome to the Menu, Monocle Radio's food and drink programme. I'm your host for today, Monica Lillis. Coming up on today's programme, we're heading to Bonnie, Scotland to meet some of the nation's most exciting culinary creators. First up, we meet the brains behind restaurant Inver, Pam Brunton, to find out her take on modern Scottish cuisine.
From the restaurant, it's like, well, they tell a very difficult story of the last 500 or more years of kind of political history of Scotland and Britain.
Also on the programme, we sit down with the lead bartender at Gleneagles to find out how he blends the history of the hotel into his cocktails.
It's very rooted in the 1920s and 30s in the way that the service is provided. We still have silver service and live piano every night.
Plus, we visit London's first ever dedicated Scottish deli. All that here on the Menu on Monocle Radio. When it comes to answering the question, what is Scottish cuisine, you can be sure that different people will give you different answers. Some might think up the stereotypical images of traditional haggis, neeps and tatties, whereas some will head straight to the chip shop to unwrap a deep-fried Mars bar. And whilst these dishes make up a part of the country's culinary culture, an increasing number of Scottish chefs are embracing and experimenting with the idea of modern Scottish food, a more refined and contemporary approach to the nation's dishes. One chef at the forefront of this movement is Pam Brunton, whose award-winning restaurant Inver in the west of the country champions the concept of a modern version of her home nation's cuisine by utilising the bounty of the nature around her. From oysters and kelp to cob nuts and heather, Pam's menus embrace Scotland's indigenous flavours, whilst recognising the importance of incorporating ingredients that were introduced into local diets at a later date too. In her new book, Between Two Waters, Pam examines Scotland's culinary history and unpacks the significance of food heritage to our collective identity. Pam sat down with the Menu's Chiara Romella and started by telling her an anecdote from the book about a customer who called up the restaurant to ask her what cuisine they serve.
The guy on the phone, he asked what kind of food do you do, and I listed what we were doing at the time, which was a lot of rare breed, native breed, like lamb done into very traditional broths, and seaweeds, which have been served on the west coast of Scotland for centuries, if not millennia. And then I conclude this list of all these wonderful things that we were serving, traditional specialities and things that feel particularly Scottish to me. And he says, what about normal Scottish food like lasagna? And you go, hang on.
Something just short-circuited in your brain just then.
And lasagna, fish and chips and burgers, I think he said. And you're like, well, okay, so that is obviously part of contemporary Scottish food culture, but so are all these other things that I've just listed. It's just nobody really recognises them anymore and serves them anymore, so maybe he is the one that's right. You know, this is more normal to eat fish and chips, to eat burgers and steaks and lasagnas than it is to eat niche Shetlandic Hogmanay specialities called whipco, which is a kind of whipped custard. That became the central question to the book. So what I said to him is, and what I said to people in the early days of Inver, is, well, we do modern Scottish food. But then, as well as saying modern Scottish food and using, contemporary presentation and things that are kind of in fashion, if you like, foraging and all the rest, we serve things that have been Scottish for millennia. Literally, there have been cooks on Lachlan Bay steaming cockles and grinding barley for millennia. There's a castle from the restaurant, across the bay from the restaurant, now in ruins, but there's been a castle on that spot since records began, or before records began. So you're talking sort of 1200s, 1300s or before, and we are just the latest in a long line of cooks who have served and all these produce on the bay. But he seemed to have the culture's consensus. He was right. This was normality for Scottish people, was to eat lasagna and fish and chips more than it was to eat things that we have collected for ourselves on the shore or raised for ourselves. And that, as you say, raised the whole question of the book. It's like, well, why is there a difference? What have we lost? Where did all this other stuff come from? Even if you look at haggis, neeps and tatties, it's the classic sort of archetypal Scottish food that appears in tourist board manuals and publicity. People know it from abroad. But the ingredients of haggis, you've got oats, which come from Anatolia originally. The spices, black peppers from the Western Ghats of India, allspice from the West Indies. Potatoes, tatties themselves, come from Peru. Neeps, the turnips, were imported originally as animal feed to rescue a starving rural population in the 1800s, part of the agricultural revolution in Scotland. But today, all of these exotic ingredients have come together into this dish that we now consider like archetypally Scottish. If you start tracing the stories of all of these ingredients, you find that there is a lot more to tell than just kind of like what a simple menu would tell you. You know, there's the history of colonialism and the rise of capitalism and gender dynamics in and out of the kitchen and all of the big questions. And even then you can go kind of back and it's like, well, where did this come from? Like today, most of us would consider the idea of colonialism abhorrent. You know, it's a highly relevant topic given what's going on in the world right now. At the time, it felt like, well, there must have been some way of making this acceptable to the public. Like, what was going on behind the scenes that this became normal at the time? And the question, it turns out, is still relevant. We are operating on these, like, as a modern society, operating on these assumptions that were first brought about by 1600s, philosophers of the 1600s, that we still haven't unpicked, we still haven't rubbished, and we still haven't challenged. And they're behind the big gender divide, questions of social injustice, the way we treat the environment, the climate crisis. They're all coming from these assumptions about human beings and the relationship to each other and the natural world.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. And I suppose I'd like to continue mining this idea of nationality, which is in itself a whole big can of worms. But in the phrase modern Scottish food, there isn't just modern, there's also Scottish. What is Scottish? You know, I define myself as Italian so often in this studio, but I don't do that so often when I'm back in Italy. I feel like frequently we use nationality to define ourselves almost by opposition rather than when we're in relation or in opposition rather than we were in the landscape. How much is that Scottishness still relevant to you 10 years on from opening the restaurant? And how much does it still inform the mentality of what you're trying to do right now? Is it still as central for spark that led you to call your food, at least shorthand it by modern Scottish at the time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. In part, the book has been a very conscious process of decolonisation, if you like. Like I was teaching myself to unpick all of these assumptions that we have about who we are and how we are in relation to the rest of the world. And the Northern Europeans don't have a great relationship to the rest of the world, in all honesty. It's been one of abuse and exploitation and extraction. And Scotland was part of that. Scotland was part of the empire. In fact, Scotland became part of Britain. The union happened because Scotland wanted access to what was then England's colonial empire. We wanted the trade links, we wanted the produce for ourselves. So there are certain aspects of Scottishness that I really don't want to identify with anymore now that I understand that dynamic. There's still plenty to celebrate, and it's not, you can't completely rubbish national identity. They do have meaning, but what is crucial to remember is that they're constantly in flux. They're constantly changing. Problems really arise when people become trenchant about their idea of identity.
I think it's interesting in light of almost like an essentialist way of nationality or provenance, or that very difficult word, authenticity, to think about the food of Scotland as the food that comes from the land of Scotland, if we take that kind of essentialist view. But even then, I think it's interesting that when you go to Scotland, a lot of the food that is presented as kind of most inherently Scottish is food that comes with a sort of wild connotation, right? So it's the game, it's the stuff that's fished directly from the sea or the lochs. How much of that landscape really is essentially wild, and how much of landscape in Scotland also means a landscape that has been transformed by human? How much of this idea of the wild game and the wild Scottish produce is really rooted in reality?
I would say none anymore.
That's a good start.
But I think it's the case all across the planet.
Yeah,
I don't
course.
think there's a single landscape that can really anymore be claimed as untouched by human intervention. But it's the kind of fascinating thing, and the landscape is only as wild as we are wild. We have shaped each other. All of human learning has come from the world outside our head, and in turn we have shaped it. You know, we learned how to farm by watching nature. We learned how to raise animals, how to raise grains, and we have in turn shaped that landscape around us. It was one of the big reasons for writing the book, was I was seeing this kind of disconnect between how other people bought into the restaurant. It's situated in this beautiful relatively remote location, surrounded by inverted commas. You can't see me doing the little finger gesture, but wild, unspoilt landscape. And this is what, you know, people would arrive and be like, oh, it's so beautiful, it's so unspoilt. I feel so distant from culture, and I'm kind of going, well, that's a spruce plantation, and that's a fish farm, and and that castle, and those two castles. You can see two castles from the restaurant. It's like, well, they tell a very difficult story of the last 500 or more years of kind of political history of Scotland and Britain. So I'm seeing a completely different thing to what all of these other people are seeing. And it felt increasingly like I was kind of buying into this and just going along with it. I was telling a lie. So it became really important to tell all the other stories that were going on about, well, actually, what is this landscape? It actually tells the story of human beings and human history and how we've evolved and how we've created and what we could do differently.
There's also something really interesting about the idea of a so-called, again, in inverted commas, destination restaurant. And is a so-called destination restaurant inherently more connected to the landscape that surrounds it just because it is in a context that feels more natural, or no? And what is the role of a destination restaurant in the landscape that surrounds it?
I think all landscapes are mediated by human minds, like the people who have shaped the landscapes, and then the people who come to perceive them. So, yeah, sure, I am definitely more physically connected to the produce that I will walk out of the restaurant and we will pick seashore greens from the shore. We will pick berries and nuts from the hedgerow. We physically do that. And a lot of those things are, if you like, naturally occurring. We didn't plant them. No one did. So, yes, there is a sense in which case we are definitely living in a much closer connection to the food and the produce than if you were in a city restaurant and everything arrives in boxes at the back door and you don't really know where it came from or what landscape. Perhaps the cooks have never visited it. There is a sense in which we are more connected, but ultimately I think you do have to understand that it's the human beings that are telling all these stories about the food and the produce. We are creating these understandings.
How has your approach to your own cooking changed in the last 10 years? Like, what has it very much? I suspect it has.
It has. I've got better at it. We have got better at running the whole show. So, and as you grow as a restaurant, you attract more and better staff who have their own contributions to make. We get better. I got better at being a manager to enable those contributions and, to change my role slightly to become more of a kind of conductor than the musician, the solo musician, which is an enormously satisfying position to be in. So we've got better, but also I think I've edited out a lot of peripheral things that maybe don't matter so much. And I think the more I go on as a cook, the more interested I am in simple things that showcase craft, because there's so much complexity in, for instance, a piece of cheese. If that piece of cheese has been, made by the same woman who milked the cow, you're serving it on the same piece of land that was grazed, and really, why would you want to mess with that? Cheese is already a really complex matured dairy, layers of fermentation, bacteriological action, all sorts of things going on in it. And I'm just more and more interested in the kind of the craft that goes into the whole thing and less interested in making absolutely everything myself. It's like if I can get that piece of cheese from this woman with her beautiful Jersey cows, who's made the whole thing herself, and be able to present it living on the same piece of grass that cow has been grazing. Like, I think that's a really beautiful thing in itself, and gives a completely different conception of what it is to relate to land through food.
Pam Brunton there, speaking to the Menu's Chiara Romella. This is The Menu. When it comes to Scottish luxury, there are a few names that hold such resonance as Gleneagles. This landmark hotel and estate, nestled in the rugged Perthshire countryside, has long been lauded for its take on tradition as well as its stellar service and attention to detail, making it a touchstone for global hospitality giants for over a century. Another thing Gleneagles gets right is its dedication to its culinary offerings. From acclaimed Michelin-starred restaurants to glamorous high-end cocktail bars, the resort's drinking and dining outposts take pride in its traditional Scottish heritage, whilst blending together modern elements and allowing the brand to remain a highlight in the nation's gastronomic scene. Michele Mariotti is the head of the bar programme at the Gleneagles Hotel. He joined me in the studio at Midori House to tell me about the hotel's centenary year and explain the work that goes into mixology there.
When I was a kid, I really enjoyed being up at night. So I always had two careers in mind, either DJing or making cocktails. So yeah, as soon as I had the opportunity, I just jumped into it. At the beginning, I started to work in a travel agency because traveling is also another thing I really enjoy. And I thought I could travel more through my career. But I ended up completing my studies and then working in a travel agency. During my studies, I also worked in a bar in a 5-star hotel by the coast. What I've noticed as soon as I've actually started my office job in a travel agency is that the vibe on a Monday to Friday is very, very different from the vibe in a bar. I get a lot of energy from the people around me. I felt that on a Monday, a lot of people were bringing a lot of negative energy to the office because it was the beginning of a stressful working week for them. While as opposed to that, when I worked in the bar, it was completely different. Like, people come there because they want to have a good time, they want to be entertained, and they want to be part of an enjoyable experience. And so just being able to deliver that and just feed off this positive energy is something that really, really attracted me to this profession. So I was hooked up to it from the very beginning. So I then eventually moved to London because my very first cocktail book was a Savoy cocktail book. I always wanted to work at the Savoy, which is a job I eventually landed. And so that after about 4 or 5 years there, I eventually moved to other properties. I worked at the Barclay, for instance, here in London. I had a short stint in Singapore for about 2 years at the Mandarin Oriental, and then I eventually looked at another iconic property I wanted to be part of, which is obviously Gleneagles. I remember reading about it while I was based here in London, and it was something that, loving Scotland and whiskey, spirits in general, and just the rugged landscapes that you get there. And then reading about this legendary property, I always wanted to be part of it. And so when the opportunity came in 2020, I just couldn't resist and I moved over.
So we'll move on now to talk a little bit about the brand. It's kind of, when I think of Scottish luxury, you think of Gleneagles. It's kind of one of the first things that pops into your head. Could you just tell me a little bit about the brand and kind of its heritage? You'd understood it from a young age, I guess, when you were thinking about properties.
Absolutely.
But what have you learned now about the brand and its heritage?
Well, so Gleneagles itself started as so we were actually opened by a railway company at the very beginning of our history. They had this beautiful patch of land and they've decided to build a hotel from the get-go there. So this means that some of the facilities that we have are built for all intents and purposes to be hospitality-led, which is great. For instance, our cellar is absolutely magnificent. We're blessed with space and we can convert it into a dining space. It's just absolutely phenomenal. But in terms of the brands itself, we like to describe it as the Riviera of the North in a way, because we are still very well connected to all major cities. We have, 5 direct trains to London every day. We have our own train station. It's called Gleneagles train station, just in case you get confused with names. But there's still this very, very strong connection with the city life. So I think the best way to describe it in my mind is literally to have it as a gateway place. Like the Riviera of the North to me sounds like a perfect way to describe it, really.
Yeah, that's a lovely, lovely description. And as you say, it's kind of this rugged mountain landscape. So it's got this different landscape, but it's still this beautiful vista that you have when you're there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like we have this valley in front of the hotel. It's called the Glen. It's absolutely magnificent. And then also I think another key element of Gleneagles itself is just it tends to bring its heritage to life through some of the experiences that you can have in there. For instance, the Strathern feels very rooted in the 1920s and 30s in the way that the service is provided. We still have like silver service and live piano every night with some outstanding, beautiful views from the main dining room. So, yeah, I still think that we dip in and out with some of our product into our heritage. But, I think our tagline this year, we turned 100 years old, was 100 years in the making. So this means that we are aware of our rich heritage, but we are a brand that very much looks forward, in the way that we develop our products.
Amazing. And I'm going to ask you one more question about that tradition, if I may. As you say, it's in the making, but it's still a very important part of the brand.
Absolutely.
How do you reflect that in the cocktails that you make?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, what we do is we ensure that whenever we create drinks for one of our venues, we are quite deliberate into, first of all, defining what the boundaries of that specific venue are, just to understand specifically what the DNA of that specific bar is. And then once we establish that, we then develop drinks according to that. So in terms of our property, we'll have places like our brasserie where we have very, very Mediterranean style drinks. I guess that the venue that embodies Gleneagles as a whole in the best way possible is probably the American bar, which is our cocktail bar, the main cocktail bar of the hotel. When we create drinks there, for instance, we look at what is it that Scotland has to offer. So what is it that Perthshire has to offer? Because we are rooted in Scotland, right? It's one of our core pillars. And it's why when we started to work on that specific menu, we realized that Perthshire does berries very well, strawberries and raspberries, for instance. So we thought, why don't we make a book about berries? So we looked at the specific botanical berries. First of all, we identified what a berry is, just pure Wikipedia definition. And then we started to just compile a menu with berries that we could work with. We then, halfway through the process, realized that strawberries and raspberries are actually not berries. So, yeah, we ended up making a menu with aubergines and avocados. But we still find ways to either work with our local suppliers when it comes to sourcing some of these ingredients or working with our hotel and our gardens to sort of reuse some of the secondary ingredients that we have on our estate. For instance, aubergine skins or avocado seeds. So we make sure that we are still rooted in Scotland even when we work with ingredients that are somewhat from the outside world. So we literally try to get like the land to speak through our drinks, if this makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That really piques my interest. An aubergine skin cocktail. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, it's absolutely delicious, actually. So I'm not a big vodka person, but this is a vodka drink, and it happens to be probably my favorite drink from the menu. So we, for some of the purées and sauces in the main restaurant, they use aubergine, the flesh, right? Which you would, right? And so we were just wasting all this skin, which has a very, very different flavor from aubergine. So when throughout this exercise, we've noticed that there's two different categories of ingredients, really. There's the ones where the secondary ingredients, meaning skins and seeds or whatever, the bits that you won't use, they taste exactly like the fruit, if not even more. For instance, banana, the banana peel, once baked, tastes more banana-y than banana. While with aubergine, it's the second category of ingredients, which are very, very different. So they develop a completely different flavor that you wouldn't necessarily associate with aubergine. So in this case, it becomes very, very vegetal, almost like aniseedy in a way. And so this allows us to make a very, very light, fresh and zesty, like vodka sour sort of drink, meaning vodka, lemon sugar, and a touch of protein for the foam. But then by infusing it with the baked aubergine skins, we just get this beautiful, very, very vibrant flavor out of it. Absolutely delicious drink.
Amazing. What is your favourite spirit to work with?
I think it's difficult to ask.
Asking to pick a favourite child.
Exactly. We all have a favourite child. We just don't feel comfortable saying it out loud. No. I mean, it must be whiskey, right? So we're in the middle of whiskey land. So I thought I always loved whiskey, but being in the middle of it, it just allows you to see how much diversity there is within such a category that is so rooted into tradition. So you always think that, whiskey itself is sort of like a monolithic entity that doesn't have a lot of diversity within it. But then once you start interacting with some of perhaps of the smaller producer or even some of the perhaps larger but more forward-thinking producers, you realize that you have such a plethora of flavors to work with and such a huge variety of methods and ethoses behind it. So it really allows you to connect with the people who make it. I absolutely love whiskey. Like, as a matter of fact, we're working on a little project at the moment where we're getting to select different whiskies for a cocktail. And so we will be able to bring this drink to life simply by changing the whiskey, which we have developed from the ground up with a different producer. So, yeah, very exciting category.
Of course, I have to ask you about your favourite whiskey cocktail then.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think the ultimate whiskey cocktail for me must be a Rob Roy. So Rob Roy is the Scottish interpretation of a Manhattan, which is a very classic drink. It's usually made of American whiskey, some sort of vermouth, and the bitters. So it's one of those drinks that is incredibly easy to make at home. And it's one of those drinks that you can just bottle yourself and keep in the freezer. So you can just like literally pour yourself one when you want without having to go through the faff of making it. But I love Rob Roy's because first of all, vermouth is such an important ingredient from my home country. Like we drink vermouth all the time, and it has the right combination of like bitter and sweet. Bitter is a flavor that we grew up with where I'm from. So I get to work with that, which is something that is quite close to my roots. But then also I get to work with that whiskey, which is such a diverse spirit, as we discussed, meaning that we can literally change the character of the drink based on small changes, but they're actually quite fundamental to the drink itself. Basically just changing the whiskey, really. So very, very cool drink.
Michele Mariotti of Gleneagles speaking to me in the studio at Midori House. This is the menu on Monocle Radio. Now it's time for the week's top food and drink headlines. Here is Monocle's Mariella Bevan.
Queijo de Ovelha Amanteigado, a soft buttery sheep's milk cheese from Portugal, has been named the best in the world at this year's World Cheese Awards. The event, which was held in Viseu in northern Portugal, saw the underdog cheese beat 2 Swiss competitors as well as Spanish and American cheeses. Despite more than 4,786 cheeses from 47 countries entering the British-run competition, many cheeses made in the UK were unable to compete in the final round due to failing post-Brexit customs checks. As many as 252 cheeses from 67 British makers were affected. The world's largest olive oil producer, Diolo, is predicting the price of the commodity to cool, bringing one of the most difficult periods for the industry to an end. Over the last couple of years, the mixed impact of climate change and inflationary pressures saw the consumer price of olive oil skyrocket, with a record high seen in the EU in January. According to Diolo, the 2024 to 2025 season will see prices fall to half the levels seen at the first half of the year. And finally, US-based airline Delta is teaming up with burger chain Shake Shack to bring the outpost's beloved menu to the skies. Starting this December, first-class passengers of flights from Boston, that cover more than 900 miles, will be able to get a Shake Shack cheeseburger as part of their in-flight dining experience. This collaboration builds on Delta's relationship with Union Square Hospitality Group, the founders of Shake Shack, whose catering arm already supplies meals on flights out of New York's JFK. Those are the week's food and drinks headlines. Now, back to Monica.
Thanks, Mariella. You're listening to The Menu. When people migrate to new places, their cuisine tends to follow. It's self-evident that London is a culinary melting pot, thanks to the continuous flow of new arrivals. Yet, despite the geographical proximity of their native land, for Scottish nationals, it has been difficult to find food that tastes like home. This is what inspired Greg Boyd to launch Old Hag. What began as a pandemic startup delivering neeps and tatties to homesick Scots quickly evolved into a market stall and then collaborations with well-known restaurants such as Gordos Pizza and catering events for the Scottish Government. Now, Old Hag has opened its first bricks and mortar shop, The Shope. As well as being a cafe serving freshly baked square sausage rolls, haggis pieces and macaroni pies, it is also London's first and only fully Scottish deli. Monocle's Lily Austin took a trip to the Shope in North London's Islington. After being strongly encouraged to taste one customer's peppermint slice, who described it as just like his mum used to make, she sat down with Greg to hear more about Old Hag's mission to shout about Scottish cuisine.
It was during lockdown 2021, it was just coming up to Burns night, and I was surprised I couldn't get any Scottish food and drink in London. You know, it seemed pretty crazy to me, so I just wanted to do something about it really, so the only way to do that was to set up my own food and drink business, so that was the origins of it. So I decided that I would set up a website and offer people the chance to buy haggis, neeps and tatties that I would make in the flat. I would rustle that up and then I would literally cycle it to people's doors and drop it off as a total experiment at the start. and then it just slowly grew arms and legs over the months following that January.
And for a listener who isn't so familiar with Scottish cuisine, how is it different to other kinds of British cuisine? And why do you think this is the first Scottish deli that we have in London, despite being so geographically close?
Yeah, there's a few things to note there. I think first of all, I'd say like in a UK level, no country probably does the best job at promoting the produce that we have. We kind of look to dishes, so that's why you think of countries like Italy and Spain when we think of good food, because they've got the dishes that everyone knows, you know, from whether it be pizza, paella, dishes like that we don't really have. Like, we sort of just look at fish and chips or steak pie or something, when actually what I've tried to do with the Scottish side is focus in on the ingredients, the produce, and really highlight that, and then the dishes kind of just come after that, you know, so I'm not really talking about dish names. So I think what I'm doing isn't necessarily groundbreaking, it's just taking what we already have and then shouting about it a bit louder than maybe other countries in the UK have done before. I mean, what separates us, I think, from the rest is we have got an abundance of really good seafood, cheese, meats, businesses that are located across the country that have maybe been working away for years and years and just haven't really found like a good brand to showcase it. They haven't got good marketing. It's usually an older demographic who don't even have a website, you know, even if a phone number. So I think what I try to do again is get in touch with those guys and work out a way to transport the stuff down regularly and then make a meal of it, literally. Because I think what's probably held people up from doing this before is just the logistics. I mean, it's hard to bring venison down from the Highlands when that person doesn't have a website and you're relying on a phone call to check where it is and when it was posted, and then do that every week. It's another thing altogether. And then the other thing as well is that a lot of baked stuff, baked goods that we have in Scotland are only really a Scottish thing. Like we have an Empire biscuit, we have a morning roll. Like a lot of that isn't eaten in England, Wales, Northern Ireland. So outside of Scotland, people don't really understand that, and that's really cool because I get to bake that here downstairs in the shops. We bake that on site every day, show people that side of Scottish food. So yeah, I think to answer your last question, it's just hard, you know, to make it work, and it's only really from the last 4 years of building up slowly to this, creating relationships, working out how to bake some of these things ourselves so we're not relying on transport every week, getting a really good meat source, getting really good cheese suppliers, and then finding smaller producers, like whether that be Jamie up in Skye who roasts the coffee for us, or the flour in North Berwick from Mungles Wells Mill. It's just finding these people who's taking time and then just saying, right, how are we going to get this stuff down? And then it all suddenly seems like it's like, oh, that was easy, but it's still to this day is a nightmare, honestly. But it's fun. It's fun at the same time.
Tell us about the menu, talk us through it. I know that you've got a new menu for autumn.
Yeah.
What are some of your favourite dishes?
Yeah, the menu in the shop is structured like around breakfast and lunch, simple. But I mean, breakfast is one of those things you don't really change in Scotland. Like once you've got your morning roll, you can have 3 different types of rolls. So you can have a soft, a crispy, or a well-fired roll. Each part of Scotland has its own preferences. Every person has like a die-hard preference to whatever roll, and then whatever they have in the roll is massive as well. So breakfast has kind of already got enough going on, so we don't really change that too much. The lunch is where we can experiment a bit more. In Scotland, a sandwich is also known as a piece. So we've got our pieces, and every month we'll basically look at the seasons. We'll get some new meat in, maybe new seafood, and then we'll develop a free sandwich menu around that, so it gives us a chance to experiment. And then we also have pies in the cabinet, which again are different from the rest of the pies. Say in England, we have a round, tall walled side with a lid that's recessed in the pie. It looks totally different, eats differently as well, and it's just like pure nostalgia for Scots. So that's kind of the basis of the menu. As we get into autumn, we're going to start building in things like soups, some stews. We also open later on a Friday and Saturday night, which gives us a chance to do like a pop-up item or a supper club. So for example, we've done things like a sub where we're using Scottish pork and when we're using some whiskey in the sauce rather than a vodka sauce, and then we're using Scottish cheese. So we're like building in all the Scottish produce, but at the end of the day it's really a meatball marinara, but we've just reconstructed that using Scottish produce. Looking ahead, we've just announced our first collaboration night where we're going to focus on different regions around Scotland, and we're going to bring a restaurant or a cafe down from that region with their produce and we're going to bring a distillery down from that region, and we're going to bring entertainment down from that region. So the one night only, you're going to get a chance to see what goes on there. So the first one is on the 8th of November, focused on the Isle of Skye with Cafe Cool. So we have things like Skye langoustines and lobster and black pudding and lamb and wild sorrel, and it's already sold out. We just put that up yesterday, so that's all sold out in 24 hours. So I think there's a real appetite for what we're doing, whether that be the breakfast, which is just your rolls, or a bit more refined supper club where people get to come sit down and eat the food and kind of be transported away to a different region. So that's what we have the option and power to do, having the shop, and I think it's super cool.
Just finally, when I was coming in, I could hear lots of Scottish accents around me, and I was confidently informed by one of your customers that people come on a pilgrimage to here to eat the food here because you just can't find this kind of Scottish cuisine outside of Scotland. How does that feel to know that you're giving people a place to find that food that is obviously so special to all of us, the food that we love from our childhood and from our homeland, I guess?
Yeah, I'd say for people who come in, they're used to bringing Scottish food back in their suitcase, or they've got people sending it from who knows where in Scotland. So people are just happy to make this pilgrimage because they've been doing some pretty mad stuff to get the food already. So I think for us to be I call it a Scottish community centre is always the phrase I use, because it feels like that when everyone's in here having a roll and tables are chatting across from each other, they don't know each other, and then they realise that they do know someone from Scotland. I think the food is one part, but the cultural side of the whole business is massive as well, connecting people in the city, and it's the sort of thing we want to try and do, not just in London but in other areas, and even in Scotland. I think there's opportunity to do what we've got here in Scotland. I think there's a lack of these types of places that are focusing purely on Scottish food and drink in Scotland itself, and that's kind of where we're going to head to next. So this is like the blueprint we're trying to build, and then we'll take that on and do it elsewhere.
And that's all for this edition of The Menu. Remember, we are back with a new episode again on Friday at 2000 London time. That's at midday in San Francisco. Also, don't forget to tune into our spin-off show, Food Neighbourhoods, for a tour of some of the world's tastiest destinations. This week's programme was produced by me, Monica Lillis, and our sound engineers were Lily Austin and Elliot Greenfield. Thanks for listening, and until next week.